So we're just going to finish up these last few slides. There's a lot of pictures here, but we're just going to kind of move through these. A lot of this is pretty self-explanatory and you can kind of read the slides, but I just want to give a little bit of additional information. So we've talked about the cerebrum here, which is sort of this outer area. Now we're going to talk about the diencephalon and those especially those subcortical structures there. So one particular area that's really important to know about the diencephalon is that it contains the thalamus. And the thalamus here you can see is kind of egg-shaped. You have one on each side. Also includes the hypothalamus. But let's start with the thalamus first. The thalamus is the gateway to the cortex for sensory systems. In fact, there's some argument about this gateway system not functioning properly in people with sensory issues, like, for example, schizophrenia. And if this gateway is not working properly with telling the brain what kinds of sounds and sights and sensations to pay attention to, that kind of makes sense how this can get confused and confusing in a particular brain, like a person who has schizophrenia. And so the thalamus also contains reciprocal loops with all cortical regions, and that's a really important feature. And the projections of the thalamus are pretty extensive throughout the cortex. Here's another view of the thalamus specifically, and you can see that you have one on each side of the hemisphere. Looking at the structure of the thalamus. So this is one structure, and we've kind of split it into different sort of sections. It's made up of a series of nuclei, and these nuclei we've kind of split into, for example, the lateral geniculate nucleus, the medial geniculate nucleus, the ventral posterior, and the pulvinar a part of the thalamus. And so we're going to talk about these more later. So if I were to say something like the lateral geniculate nucleus, to know that that's in the thalamus is an important feature. So, so for example, here, this is a lateral geniculate nucleus, knowing where it is and that it is housed in the thalamus. Now, the hypothalamus, which is located below the thalamus, is a group of nuclei. This is really important for hormone function. This is really important for the communication to the pituitary gland. It has connections to the pituitary gland, and we'll talk more about those connections later. The hypothalamus is the floor of the third ventricle. And as you can imagine, is situated right below the thalamus. And so what kinds of things is the hypothalamus important for? Well, it's important for all of our basic functions like hunger and feeding, sexual behavior. It's really important for sleeping. It sends the message for melatonin, for example, important for temperature regulation and emotional behavior because of the involvement with hormones. So we're going to talk a lot more about the hypothalamus later, especially when we get into sleep. There's some of these structures here that we're really going to talk very extensively about, given their particular function. So we talked about the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Now let's talk about the midbrain here, which looks like a small sort of feature. This includes, here you can see the midbrain here, okay? This includes the tectum and the tegmentum. And so here you can see the tectum, which is the roof, and then tegmentum, which is the floor. And so the tectum includes the superior and inferior colliculi. And so we talked about the superior colliculus being sort of the front part of the, it's a very good landmark of the corpus callosum, whereas the inferior colliculus is kind of the back part as a really good landmark of where the corpus callosum kind of is in the back. And then you have, as part of the tectum, you have the sensory processing area. So this is really important for visual and auditory processing, important for orienting yourself. So being able to hear a sound and know kind of where to turn your head to do that. The tegmentum, which is the floor, includes the substantia nigra, which we talked a little bit about, the red nucleus, and the reticular formation, which we'll get into the reticular formation later on in consciousness. This is really important. The tegmentum is really important for eye and limb movements. And we talked about substantia nigra being really important for initiating movement, as well as, for example, pain perception. And I've got even more information here about the different structures here. And so you can see that this is really important for the tectum, which includes the superior colliculus, inferior colliculus here. And then you can see the red nucleus reticular formation, for example, which is important in the tegmentum. Further continuing on with the midbrain, you can see that these particular areas are really important because they contain these fiber tracts that run from the forebrain to the spinal cord, also run to the cerebellum and brainstem, very important for being able to send and receive information along those tracks. We're also going to talk a bit about the hindbrain, which is essentially the oldest part of the brain, if we look at this sort of evolutionarily speaking. So this is important because this keeps us alive, this keeps us breathing, this keeps us functioning. If you damage the hindbrain, that can lead to immediate death. So the hindbrain contains the cerebellum, reticular formation, pons, medulla, and these are all structures that you're going to see are really important later on to consciousness, being able to wake from sleep, things like that. So it's also important for various motor functions, automatic functions like breathing, as well as balance and fine motor movements. The cerebellum, we always thought, was just for major balance, but we've found that the cerebellum is also really important for fine motor movements like writing with a pencil. These are all really important features of the cerebellum. The reticular, brainstem, and specifically the reticular formation, is going to come out to be very much. We're going to talk a lot about that because it's very important when it comes to like sleep and consciousness. And the projections with the reticular formation actually go. So this is kind of, it's not really a structure. It's more of like we've zoned it out in this particular area of the midbrain or hindbrain. And so what this is a series of connections that go to the run through the midbrain or runs through the pons, the medulla, and it stimulates the forebrain for wakefulness. And so if you were to sever this area, you might be in like a coma and not be able to be aroused. And so these nerve fibers, like I said, are not actual, like it's not an actual structure that you can pull out and look at. It's more of like a series of connections. And they also contain things like connections to REM on, REM off cells to allow for us to be able to experience rapid eye movement during sleep. Like I said, we're going to get much more into that later. So let's move to the pons. So we've talked about the cerebrum, the diencephalon, midbrain, and so let's talk about the pons. The pons tend to be a pretty easy structure to identify. If you look at, for example, this area right here, it tends to be this kind of big hump, and this is something that you can really identify pretty easily if you're looking at this sort of brainstem region. Here you can see like the thalamus here, and the pons are beneath the thalamus and under the midbrain here. So these contain fiber tracts. They project to the spinal cord, project to the brainstem and cerebellum, contain the pontine nuclei, which is really important for vestibular function, being able to, maintain your balance, very important for auditory function. Also contain nuclei for visual motor purposes and extraocular muscles, being able to control your eyes, and of course also have projections in the reticular formation, which again we will talk about things like REM on, REM off cells and how they're housed in those particular areas. Now let's talk about the medulla here, which is kind of the bottom part of the spinal cord. So the medulla is an important feature because it contains these pyramidal tracts, And these projections are cortical spinal motor projections. And so these do cross contralateral, so those motor axons are going to cross sides here. So this is kind of like a section where you can see where these tracks, this would be like the ventricle, this is the dorsal side, this is the ventral side, and then these right here are the pyramidal tracks. And then these olivary nuclei here, these are going to project to the cerebellum, really important for things like motor learning, procedural learning. The medulla is very important for being able to stay alive and have those involuntary features like breathing, cardiac control, things like that. So if you were to sever the medulla, there's a good chance that it potentially could be immediate death, because the person would no longer be able to breathe, their heart wouldn't beat, things like that. So this is a much older section of the brain. This is sort of the more vital function. Think of the brain kind of evolving around this, because these are the basic functions that the brain needs to be able to live and to be able to control the body. So finally, we're going to hit the cerebellum, which is right here. This is a structure that we've talked about in class, and I've shown you guys is not, even though we talk about the hemispheres of the cerebellum, it actually is one structure here. It's kind of referred to as the little brain, and it has a lot more functionality than we originally thought. We really thought it was just motor, balance. That was it, just balance. So motor connections and just important for balance. But now we're learning that it's much more important for more than just balance. Of course, it is posture and walking and things like that. But these coordinated movements and more fine motor movements are really important features of the cerebellum. And so these really deep nuclei, you're going to see here that the way that the cerebellum is sort of constructed with the different kind of neurons is a really interesting and different kind of setup. And you can actually see that with all of these little ridges in the way that, and we're going to talk about this in development, in the way that these layers are constructed. And so again, important for motor coordination, important for learning. And then it contains 3 levels. So these are 3 layers. So these are probably, important to think about in terms of the fact that each of these cells looks a little different and has a little bit different of a function. So we have this layer right here. We have a granule layer, granule cell layer here, which is, you can kind of put these up here in terms of where these layers are. And then we have a Purkinje cell layer, and then we have a molecular cell layer. And so this is the outermost layer, the ones that has all the ridges, also called parallel fibers. Just a really interesting structure in terms of what these neurons look like. And we'll get more into some of the function later on. This is just kind of really basic stuff to know that it's not just balance that cerebellum is involved with. So here you can see this is kind of the whole central nervous system structure here, the brain and spinal cord. And we've talked about how the brain is sort of categorized and split up here. And then here, this is where the spinal cord ends. And then we have our thoracic nerves, the lumbar nerves. We have the cervical nerves here. Ooh. And then we have, sorry, it's my pen has gone awry. And then the lumbar nerves and so on. And so I've talked before about the fact that it's important for you to know that these nerves are categorized and exist, not necessarily important to memorize every single of the cranial nerves. And I'm more concerned with you knowing these major organized, how they're organized in this way. And then, of course, we're going to end with the spinal cord here. And we can see here about how, and we've talked about this before, about those dorsal roots, the dorsal root ganglion, and how that's sort of structured. We've talked about that in a previous class. There is gray matter on the inside, and then the ventral horns are important for motor outputs, whereas the dorsal horns are important for sensory inputs. And so because we have the ability for those to be on each lateral side, you can see here and here on each side split, if we kind of split it in the middle, those are important for input into the brain for us to be able to sense the environment around us as well as be able to interact with our motor function. Additionally, we have to think about reflexes. And so the spinal cord can actually act independently of the brain, especially when you consider something that needs to be done very quickly, that doesn't have the luxury of taking the time to get to the brain, from the brain, and then the brain to be able to coordinate that activity. So one particular function that is independent is the spinal reflex. This is an automatic movement, this is any kind of like knee-jerk reflex, anything that you do without thinking. This is something that helps protect us. And this is something that's really hard to actually prevent. This is an automatic movement. So if you tell yourself you're not going to do it and you try to inhibit that response, it's really next to impossible to do that. Just, with what you have in front of you. So that kind of summarizes up the major gross neuroanatomical features. We're going to get much more in depth later on with different sections, but this is just kind of an overarching view of the major structures, how it's categorized, things like that. So I do want to go over some of the principles of the nervous system functioning. First is that the nervous system's job is to produce behavior. It doesn't do so individually. It works together. The brain's always working. We know that the nervous system is constantly changing in terms of its plastic. When you are in an enriching environment, your neurons actually change in terms of the connections that they form with one another, and creating things like dendritic spines to allow for you to increase the surface area for connections. We know that not all, but a lot of the brain circuits are crossed. So if you have an input coming in to the right side of your brain, then the output goes to the left part of your body. We call this contralateral because it's opposite sides. If it's the same side, we call it ipsilateral, but a lot of the functions are contralateral. We know that the central nervous system is functioning on multiple levels. So we have the spinal cord, the brainstem, the forebrain. We have lots of different systems working together and levels of that particular function. The brain is symmetrical and also asymmetrical. So there are some things that we have bilaterally and some things that we only have one of. We also know that the brain system is organized hierarchically as well as parallel, and this is an example of sort of how it's both hierarchical in some cases and in levels, and then parallel in other levels. So this is just something that we have to keep in mind when it comes to how we think about brain function. So the sensory and motor divisions are all throughout the nervous system. It's not just localized in one particular area. We know it's throughout the spinal cord. It's the motor cortex, somatosensory cortex, the association cortex, all of these premotor cortex, all of these areas and divisions are sort of split up, and they all work together to allow us to move and experience our environment. Another important principle is that sensory input into the brain is divided based off of object recognition and motor control. And so we know that these systems do work together to allow us to be able to navigate our environment, as well as be able to describe and sense what's around us. So an example of this is a visual system. So we have a dorsal stream and a ventral stream. So and this is the entire visual system, thinking about how we receive an input from the eyes it goes through the retina, it goes through the optic nerve, through the lateral geniculate nucleus, and it gets processed all the way back to the occipital lobe area. And then once it gets processed here, it then gets processed via the dorsal stream, which allows us to understand spatial information that helps us move around in space. We also refer to this as the wear pathway. So if you damage some part of the dorsal stream, somebody hands you an object, you might have a really hard time determining where in space that object is. So visually, the information is coming at you, and it's coming in correctly, and you can visually see it just fine. But if you go reach out to touch or pick up or take that object, you're not going to make the mark. You're going to have a really hard time visually being able to see where that is in space. We also have a ventral stream pathway, and this is what we refer to as the what pathway, and this is object identification. So let's say you damage a part of the ventral stream. What that means is that if I were to hand you a key and I say, what is this object? You might go, I have no idea what that is. You see it's a key. You can hold it in your hand and you can visualize it and you can feel it and you can see that thing, but you are not able to identify what that is. And so these pathways work together to allow for us to navigate through space, to be able to identify objects and identify what things do and where they go and how we use them. And that's how we use these streams together. So if you damage one particular stream, that's going to affect your ability to navigate your environment. Next to last one, the functions in the brain are both localized and distributed. We know that there are particular areas of the brain that are really important for certain kinds of function, like for example, the left hemisphere is really important for language function. However, there are definitely other areas that are involved with language that, in some cases our function is dependent upon our whole brain working together. And so some of them are localized, but then also others are distributed all throughout the brain. And then finally, and a really, really important feature, is that the nervous system works through excitation and inhibition. When we start to talk about action potentials and neurotransmitters and how some are excitatory and some are inhibitory, a lot of times students get confused about the fact that a particular activation is always good. Sometimes activation is not good, and sometimes when something's excitatory, you need a system to inhibit. And because a system is inhibited, that's actually good, because then it is causing another kind of behavior to happen. And we're going to talk a lot more detail about this, that the inhibitory systems are just as important, if not more important, in some cases equally important as excitation systems, and they work together to allow for us to produce very complex behaviors. So we're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to neurochemistry and how action potentials work and how neurons communicate and how they function. But it's really important to kind of say that here. So if you have any questions, you can absolutely email me, and I'm happy to answer those. But again, this is just kind of a quick run through of some of the gross neuroanatomy stuff, and we're going to get in a lot more detail later, but this will serve as kind of like a major big sort of point for you to kind of recognize later on, oh, I remember we talked about the substantia nigra or the thalamus or whatever. So if you have any questions,